Thank you all for joining us for live Q&A with Data Nutrition Project. This session is a complement to the bite-sized lunchtime talk you've already watched. I want to especially thank these two incredible individuals who've now been with us 3 years in a row, providing just inspiration and excitement about what's sort of at the forefront of thinking about data. So you all are in for a treat for today. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Kasia is a technologist and producer and product leader focused on building data-driven systems. They are a current digital civil society practitioner fellow, Stanford University. Us Berkeley folks will ignore that. An affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center, whoop, whoop, Harvard University, like that. They previously worked at McKinsey & Company, the U.S. Digital Service, MIT Media Lab, and Google. Kasia is a native-born Bostonian, enthusiastic cyclist, and avid bird watcher. Newman is Director of Art and Education at MetaLab at Harvard and co-founder of the Data Nutrition Project. Working at the intersection of research and art, her work explores the interrelations of complex systems and technology's role in human experience. In addition to her art practice, she is also a facilitator and educator and leads workshops with her methodology to use creative materials to address interdisciplinary research problems. Newman holds a BA in philosophy from Washington University in St. Louis and an MFA in imaging arts from the Rochester Institute of Technology. Love that Western New York connection. She has exhibited work in New York, San Francisco, Berlin, and London, and has held artistic residencies in Germany, Sweden, and Italy. Newman is a 2017 AI Grant Fellow, a 2018 and 2020 Harvard Assembly Fellow, a 2019 Rockefeller AI Resident, and 2020-2021 Artist in Residence at Northeastern University's Center for Law, Innovation, and Creativity. And finally, a 2021-2022 grantee of the National Endowment for the Arts. We are in the presence of greatness with these two people. Her current work explores various dimensions of complex technological and ecological and social systems and uses interactive art as a means of critique and public engagement. In order to take you all on this journey, I am proud to introduce Nayanthara, one of our SICSS-Howard Mathematica alums, who will moderate our panel, and I will exit stage left.
Thanks, Nanette. My name is Nayanthara Biswas, and I'm a PhD candidate in economics at Clark University. My dissertation focuses on the impact of public policies on maternal and child health and labor outcomes in a global context. And I'm currently working as a research fellow for equity at the Applied Economics Clinic. I'm also a SICSS-Howard Mathematica 2022 alum, and I'm honored to introduce Kasia and Newman from the Data Nutrition Project. So to start us off, Kasia and Newman, can you both speak more on how you are where you are and how you got to your respective careers?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having us again. We're thrilled to be back for the 3rd year in a row and love speaking to you all and speaking about our work. As you may have heard from the not short bio about me, my career has not been maybe the one you would expect for somebody who comes who's doing work in technology, because I really came out of the humanities and the arts. So I studied philosophy with an interest in ethics. I went on to do work as an artist, and I still work as an artist. And most of my work involves trying to understand how people function and how to understand how we can be better as people. And that has brought me in the last, 10 to 15 years to questions around technology. And it's almost accidental that I'm work in the tech space that I do. I came to Harvard 10 years ago to be a fellow with the lab that I now co-direct called MetaLab. And MetaLab kind of sits it's very interdisciplinary. And I know we'll talk more about interdisciplinarity later because it's a big part of what the Data Nutrition Project is. But because we sit at the intersection of technology, art and design, and the humanities, I basically began to realize that the technologies we're building are mirroring the same problems and challenges ethically and otherwise that we have in society. And so it felt like art and education were a way through which I could engage these ideas, but bring them to broader publics and bring them to folks who don't often think about themselves in the room with technologists. And that career had also led me, 5 years ago now to co-found DNP, which is our acronym for the Data Nutrition Project. And the adventure continues. And with that, I will pass it over to Kasia.
Thanks, Newman. Hey, I'm Kasia, pronouns they, them. I guess I also have had a little bit of a, I guess what they're calling nonlinear career paths these days. Previously, people have called this unfocused or scattered, very diverse. So I actually, I don't have a PhD. I have a bachelor's in physics. And after that, I decided to go into consumer technology. At the time, there were a few paths to take with a physics degree. One was continuing on to a master's and a PhD. And another was to go into defense. I wasn't really excited about either of those. And so there was a third option, which in the early thousands was to go into this little company called Google, the internet boom that was happening at the time. And so I decided to do that. And so that really started my career in consumer technology. I ended up, very much like left field. I went from physics into communications. So I did PR for a while at Google. And that was actually a pretty intentional move because I realized at the end of my studies that I had been heads down focused on photons for years, and I didn't know how to talk about the things that I did. And that actually the only thing that mattered was the storytelling at the end. You can have amazing technology, you can have terrible technology, and what actually matters is how you package that up and talk about it. I mean, other things matter too, but that has an outsized impact on what actually happens to that technology. So I did that for several years. I was based in London. And at the end of that, I realized that no matter how good the story is, if the product is bad, you can't message over it. So I kind of came all the way back around and decided to go into to continue being in consumer technology as a product manager, which means that I kind of build and help lead the teams that design the products. And so I did that in consumer tech. I did that in fintech. So I moved into a startup that I helped to co-found. Then went into the MIT Media Lab. I was working on a project called Scratch, which some of you might be familiar with. It's a kids coding language and a community. I went into the US government, and I ended up at McKinsey, and now I'm more of like a freelance technologist thinking about responsible AI. I think the other kind of core component to call out is that at some point I realized that I was building systems that weren't actually made for me. So as somebody who's mixed race and non-binary and all these things, I realized that I was explicitly building technology products that cut me out of the initial MVP population. What I mean by that is kind of building for the middle part of that bell curve, that 75, 80%, which is the norm. And then everybody outside, you just ignore. And that's like the first launch you do, you just ignore everybody else outside. And so I realized that over and over again, I was basically building these products that ignored me. And that is a fairly powerful thing to recognize at some point. And so that is around the time when I had this fellowship with Newman and some other really smart folks. And we decided to create the Data Nutrition Project and turn that into a nonprofit. And that was 5 years ago.
Related to this, can you tell us a little bit more about the pros and cons of working in such an interdisciplinary team like the DNP?
Newman, go ahead.
Sure, I'll start. Well, I guess one thing to say is that interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinary is a word that is used a lot, but I often feel like it's just a word that's like slapped onto something where people aren't actually working in an interdisciplinary way. They're just saying that they are, but there actually is one particular norm or culture that gets laid upon whatever the work is, and it's much less interdisciplinary than is said. So I like to distinguish like work that's actually pushing those boundaries, including the challenges that come with it, versus just using it as like a catch-all to sort of sound like you're doing the same thing. Thankfully, our work is like the true form interdisciplinary, because we have folks on the team who are really not coming from a tech background at all, myself included. And so to be working with folks that are coming out of like social justice work, coming out of education, coming out of art and design, and also coming out of product management, engineering, data science. I would say the benefits are that let me start with the drawbacks. Some of the drawbacks are that it takes us quite a long time sometimes to make decisions, but I also think that's a benefit. And the reason is because we don't have the same assumptions about anything, because we're coming out of such different disciplinary traditions and we have such different perspectives. So I think a lot of times when you have people with the same type of training or the same background sitting in a room, they start on like step 3 of 10 steps, and we start on like step -3. Like we have to even just figure out where we're starting to go before we get there, and thinking about defining our terms. What do we mean by these terms? What kind of assumptions do we have embedded in these? It makes for some really long conversations and sometimes really slow progress. And the work is better as a result. I really think the output is better as a result. I think having to do that, I think we push back on each other's assumptions and challenges. We reflect things and we call out jargon and we reflect things that other, sort of we can't see when we're in it. And so I would say the benefit is the work is better in the end, and it speaks to a broader audience. And I would say a drawback is that it's often much slower to get there. The good thing is, and I think this is probably required for any team, but especially any interdisciplinary team, is that everybody on our team is really nice. And I think if you're going to have people from such different backgrounds, it's really important to have really nice people from different backgrounds that are really generous and kind and mutually respecting. I mean, that's required for any team, but I think especially in this case. So yeah, that's what I would say. I'm not sure what Kasia has to say. I see there's also a question.
Yeah, I mean, I would just maybe add some like concrete examples. I think I completely agree, and real diversity is hard. I think this is the part that like people don't get. It's like, oh, we want a diverse representation. We want diversity at the table. We want diverse stakeholders and people who are making decisions. And that's amazing. And you need to start there. I mean, obviously you can't have actual diversity and actual diverse output if you don't start with having people at the table. But then you actually have to like make sure that you facilitate the table. And I think that's really, really challenging. And it's everything from vocabulary, like what Newman said. So for example, we say POC. In some rooms that's going to read as person of color, people of color. In others, that's a proof of concept, right? We say API. In some rooms, that's Asian Pacific Islander. In others, it's an application programming interface, right? And these are the same acronyms that are used. And we're using these all the time in this group, and people are actually understanding them differently. And so, it's everything from vocabulary to how you actually work together, what is expected in terms of timelines, how people want to work, right? There's even something as easy as time zones. What do you do when people are all over the world and you really want to include geographic representation? That's challenging. So it's actually very difficult, I think, to have a truly diverse team and not just stop at having the people. You then need to inform the practice, and you have to actually change the process, and it makes things slower, and it makes things like sometimes like infuriatingly slow because you're talking about specific words, or you're talking about specific kind of design, and someone brings up something and then you realize you have to go back to the beginning again. But that is kind of a muscle that I think we as a team really we appreciate and we respect, and we're proud of that. And so that's what it's like to be on an interdisciplinary team in my experience.
One more question from me before we take the question from James. So related to all of, thinking through how to work in an interdisciplinary team, how to incorporate diversity in this team and in the products that you're going to be putting out, how do you measure the impact that your organization has had on the field?
Oh, it's a great question. I think so in the tech industry, there's I think now a pretty common understanding that you end up building what you measure. And that is something that we've seen a lot in social media, for example, when we're optimizing for engagement, where engagement is clicks, right? And so, you don't want to optimize the wrong behavior by measuring the wrong thing. And so in what we've built, we've thought about many different layers of impact, and we're not really driven by clicks, and we're not really driven by page views. That's one way of understanding impact and scale. And so it's important that we keep that in mind, sort of, because we do have a product. So we'll look at how many labels were created or how many people are emailing us, these kinds of things. But I think that there's also a number of layers around kind of influence and impact in the ecosystem in terms of influencing the conversation, in terms of making sure that we're reaching out to people, that we take the time to actually talk to people. We talk to students, we talk to professors, we talk to policymakers, we talk to other people in the space. One of the things I'm most proud of is not even the label itself, but the convenings that we've had. Because we're independent, we're able to bring together a lot of people into a room who otherwise wouldn't talk to each other, who are seen as competitors in the space, which is kind of silly in responsible AI. Like, how are we competing against each other instead of, just working together? And so we're able to bring people together and kind of have those conversations. So there are many different ways that we measure impact. Those are some of them, but I'll also pass it over to Newman.
That's great. I would say sometimes it's, as Kasia said, what gets built is what's measured. I also think the kind of impact we're trying to have is really hard to measure because it's often about public education and awareness and this like slowly rising tide that sometimes is rising so slowly that you don't even notice that the tide is rising. So we get feedback and we integrate that feedback through all the various stakeholders that Kasia just mentioned. And sometimes it's really hard to see, and sometimes it's really frustrating, especially being such a small group. I mean, we have this documentation project, and sort of we're sitting in this funny ecosystem where the other documentation projects, most of them are coming out of huge tech companies. So IBM has one, Microsoft has one, Google has one, Meta/Facebook has one. And then we're like, here's DMP, here. And we're also, putting forth a tool and a product and a methodology and educational materials that, in a lot of ways, because we're a nonprofit, is a huge strength, but we're also pretty small. And so to have the kind of impact we believe we can have and that we want to have while we're also pretty small and, grant funded and, otherwise kind of piecing it together is a real challenge. I think we have these moments of sort of where we realize that, like, we get people reach out from like very international contexts, and we realize like, okay, we're making an impact here. We have notifications on when we get cited, like to like get an email when we're getting cited, and it's like, wow, these people all over the world who are writing papers on machine learning and algorithmic accountability are citing us. Like that's really great. They're aware of this work. And then most recently in the AI Senate hearing, which some of you may have watched and some of you may have chosen to not watch, with Sam Altman and Gary Marcus and Christina Montgomery. I think 3 different times during that Senate testimony, the concept of nutrition labels for data sets and models came up. And so that feels like, okay, it's taking a while, but people are starting to pay attention, and a catchy metaphor can go a long way. And so I would say like maybe the most important impact is the kind that's immeasurable, and yet we're trying to measure in all the ways that we can.
Now we're going to take a question from James.
Thank you, Newman. Thank you, Kasia. I really enjoyed the metaphor that started this whole project. I love metaphors. And I want to ask what your greatest, I actually do have 3 questions if I can ask all of them. But what would you say your greatest pushback or obstacle has been starting this project? That's the first question. My second question is, you did mention in the video that your methodology is also for teaching. Can you throw more light on that? And my third question is, you mentioned how you've been working with the UN and internationally. How do you get this data labeled, and how do you kind of segue between that and then the industries that actually get to use this data? Thank you.
Those are great questions. Let me see. How about I go a little bit backwards? Maybe I can do 1 and 3, and then Newman, if you've got thoughts on 2. So you asked about pushbacks or obstacles, and also working with organizations like the UN. I think these things are related. So pushback or obstacle, I'd say that it's really hard to change culture. And what we're trying to do at the foundation of this, at the base of this, is to change our culture of data use. And the reason that's so hard is that there already is a culture that doesn't have standards really, and that people have already found internal solutions, although they might not really be solutions. They have internal ways of doing things, and we're trying to like change the course while they're in movement. And so when it comes to, it looks like we're just making a label and it's just some metadata and they could just use it and it's easy. But a lot of organizations already know how they do their data collection. They've been doing it for decades. They have a way of labeling their data. They have metadata they attach. They have a repository that already exists. They publish their data and they're like, what's wrong with that? So a good example is actually working with the UN. I think the positive part, which is helping us break through the obstacle in some cases, is that people are understanding that data quality matters. So there is definitely a need. We don't have to force people to see the value of what we're doing. It's the actual implementation and saying, how do you change your actual data practices and your culture around data? Even if you want to, there are so many obstacles internally, usually at these places, to making actual impact and change. So with the UN, we were working with a particular center inside of OCHA called the Center for Humanitarian Data, or Center for Hum Data. And they are a platform where all of the different humanitarian organizations in and outside of the UN will put their data. Then you can actually cross-reference them inside their platform as a user of that data, whether you're a journalist or someone on the ground, etc. And so they've been very, very focused for 10 years, and it's an amazing team and amazing product. They've been very, very focused on getting the data, and they're not so focused on how people are using the data. So they don't have a feedback loop about whether they're providing enough information for people to actually use the data correctly, accurately, relevantly. And so we worked with them to basically start very, very small. And so that's one way that we deal with this, is we start very small on a particular project with a very tiny scope, and we move out from there. We kind of plant the seed, and hopefully they'll start to take some of our recommendations of, you don't need to burn the whole thing down and start again. Why don't you just consider one or two things about the quality of data that you flag for your users? This is how old it is. This is how complete or incomplete it is with regards to this standard. This is how many times it's been downloaded, right? These kinds of things where, this is what the intended use of the data set is. Even just saying what the intended use is and setting some boundaries around usage of the data, and just starting small and moving out from there. So that's kind of my answers to two of your questions there. I guess I'll hand it over to Newman to add anything, and also for your question about teaching.
Thanks. One thing I would add on the obstacles, and I might just be feeling a little bit sassy today, but one obstacle is that doing quality documentation is hard, and it takes time and it takes energy, and people are lazy generally, myself included. I think people are if there's an easy way to do something and a harder way to do something, even if the harder way produces a better output, trying to get people at any scale to do the harder thing, which is to go through and actually answer questions about sort of these qualitative questions about a data set, like Takasha's example. What was the intended use of the data set? Or how should the data not be used? Or what are other known uses? Or what are some shortcomings or anomalies? Even if it's another thing, in addition to being lazy, so people tend to be proud, especially proud of their own work. So it's hard to get people to acknowledge when there might be shortcomings in a data set, even if documenting that shortcoming will be the thing that mitigates harm down the line. So it feels like an uphill battle. It feels like what we're trying to do, and this may be a reason that tide I mentioned is rising slowly, is right now, as you all know, data sets that are out there on the internet, it's kind of the Wild West. Some of them have metadata, some don't. The metadata is in different formats. Some of them have more or less documentation. Some of them have so much documentation that nobody will ever read it, or it might be out of date. And asking folks to take data sets they've already documented and make a new label for them, or new data sets that are being produced quickly to label them in this thorough way that we've created, is an obstacle. And it's definitely an obstacle at scale. And often, as you all know, sometimes the folks that are most willing to do the right thing already have the best quality data. And it's actually the folks who have worse data that we're really trying to target, but those aren't necessarily going to be the ones who are, lining up to make labels for their data sets. So I would say that is one big obstacle. And then on teaching, I'm really glad you asked about this. I know some of you are teaching or will be teaching in the future. And again, as I'm sure you know, getting students to do things that are really applied versus just talking about it in a theoretical way makes such a huge difference. So to give you a couple of examples of the ways in which we've taught, and you all are totally welcome to do this because our methodology and label maker are completely open, is we've had label making parties with students. If you call it a party, it feels more fun, even though it's actually just a session where students work in small groups. We choose a few data sets that we want them to label, and they work in small groups to make a label with the label maker tool. So they're reading or skimming, associated white papers. They're looking at the documentation that's already out there. They're looking at ways in which the data has been used, and they're working in groups to actually make a label for a data set that they just found and really think about what kind of questions come up for them. What do they learn, and how do they approach other data sets differently after doing this? What do they start to wonder when they encounter data that they didn't before by actually making this label? So that would be one example, and anybody's welcome to do that. The other I'll mention is we did one workshop where we actually had students make their own data sets, which was really fun and interesting. They only had, I think we sent them out and they had like, I don't know, 30 minutes or 45 minutes. It was a 3-hour workshop, but they didn't have a ton of time, but they had to decide, what am I collecting data on? What are the rows and columns going to be? What is my methodology for collecting this? Some of them were interviewing people. Some of them were counting like the yellow cars that they saw. It kind of didn't matter what they were making a data set on. And then they came back in and they made a label on their data set. And what they started to realize, and again, through practice, is how many choices and how many decisions get made when you're making a data set. Like this idea that data is ever neutral is so far from the truth. It's like decisions all the way down. And having students make those decisions and then label their data set created a completely different perspective on sort of how we might relate to data. So those are two examples of our teaching methodology. We always try to have fun, and we always try to have food also.
Building off of Kasha's metaphor of, a seed blooming, what are the green shoots that we need to be aware of in this field?
I would define green shoots as the new little areas of exposure, like little plants popping their heads out of the sand or out of the soil. So what are those? So if you were starting now, what would you invest your time in for all the folks here that are just getting started?
Yeah, I can take a first pass at that. I think it's kind of a combination of bottom up and top down. So some of these, what do you call it, green shoots, are number one, that things like this exist, right? So I think when I was going into tech, there wasn't really a notion of public interest tech, and there wasn't a way for students to talk about responsible tech or responsible AI. There wasn't so much of an awareness of this. And so there's definitely kind of a need that's coming up from, at least from my perspective, students who want to go into the industry and build fun things and make cool things, but also not hurt people. So I think that there's that kind of component. There's also, on the kind of top-down side, like Newman already mentioned, there's a growing awareness of the need for regulation in the space, or at least standardization. And regulation from the government might not come very quickly. And so in the absence of that, there are codes of conduct, there are groups like ours that are starting to work together and say, okay, you have one schema, we have one schema, how do we map that together? So we were actually just chatting with some folks at ML Commons who have something called Croissant, and they're trying to pull together all the different metadata schema of all the data that's on Hugging Face and that's on Kaggle and all of the TensorFlow and GitHub and all of this, and trying to start to pull this together into something that looks like one standard to rule them all, or at least one way to be interoperable between them. And so I think you're seeing these kind of community top-down type things. You're seeing maybe some government regulation eventually, maybe not even from the US, but from somewhere else. And then I think there's this growing need and recognition from the bottom up that people want to do the right thing, and they're looking for ways to do it. So those are some things that give me hope. I don't know, Newman, if there are other things you want to add.
Yeah, I would say, I guess in one sense, I think we got kind of lucky because we came up with something at a time that it was needed, and we sort of just caught this. We caught the early part of a wave. I think there's 20/20 hindsight, but I think it feels a little bit lucky that we came up with something that also had a sticky metaphor right at the time that there was growing public awareness, and then we had the skills on our team, and we were able to do the things to keep this project going and to scale it to what it is now. But to James's comment earlier on metaphors, I think thinking of really good metaphors is really useful as we're thinking about the challenges, especially things that folks can relate to. Nutrition label is one, but there's plenty of others. And it's important for it to be good, because right now in AI, there's a lot of bad metaphors floating around too. And so I think coming up with a good metaphor that makes sense for what it is that you're trying to approach, I think makes it much more relatable and much stickier in a way. And when I say sticky, I mean actually sticky, it's hard to get off your hands or hard to get off your brain. Another thing I would say, and this is maybe more general, is that I think there's an instinct to like flock to where everybody's going. So like right now, you know, I mean, we can see what's sort of happening in the space. Like, you know, there's a huge interest in large language models and foundational models, rightly. There's growing concern about that. There's other areas that are really popular. And I guess I would say, I think it's useful to think about what interests, like this would just be my advice that I would give to whomever. So, you know, ignore it if it's not useful. But I think about what draws you particularly, and not just going where the crowd is going. So it can be something within that space, but I think the more specific, the better, because I think there's just kind of, and if it's not part of that, that's even better. Like if it's something that's over here that's maybe adjacent, I actually feel like there's so much room now for sort of not what's just in the center of everybody's attention, but on the margins of attention. So for example, even though I've been working in AI and AI ethics for a long time, in the past year, because there's been, especially in the past 6 months, like everybody I know is working in AI now, almost, it feels like. I've actually feel like, okay, well, let me broaden my own horizon and see where can I make contributions here. In addition to DMP, what else might I do with my work that's not just redundant with like the 7 other people that are sitting beside me? And the thing that I've turned my attention to is education. So I think, I mean, I've been doing education for a long time, but I think it's so important. There's so much misunderstanding about AI and even what AI is and what it means and all the other terms that follow from that, and what it does and what it doesn't do, and what is a myth and what is reality. And I think, you know, one of the things I'm working on is producing broadly accessible educational materials that are vetted and responsible to help not just the folks that are already super educated make good decisions, but also help everybody else understand this space in which we're navigating. And I would say the other thing in addition to education that's been of interest to me is kind of the sociology of how people are responding, like what is happening culturally right now, I think is interesting. So that's just to say, think about what interests you. And I think if it's a little bit distinct in particular from just like all the general flows, I would say that's where some green shoots would be, in my humble opinion.
Great. Now I'm going to invite Joanna to ask her question.
So I have 2 questions. They're along the lines of advice. So my first question is respect to the data nutrition project. So what are some best practices you've observed for testing user experience with interacting with the product and making sure that it'll do what it's intended to do, and it'll be used by a lot of people from different walks of life? And then the second question is targeted toward Sarah, with respect to how to find opportunities that are at the intersection of the visual arts and technology.
Great questions. I can take the first one. So about the UX, let's see. So the real answer here, right, is that your MVP is not going to be for everyone. And I think it's really important to understand the trade-offs. So as somebody who's built product, this is like something that I have had to do many times. It can be really uncomfortable, but you have to ask yourself kind of what's the journey that you're optimizing for, and then you build that. So for us, for example, we didn't optimize for mobile because even though a lot of people are on mobile devices, we imagine that folks who are filling in this label are probably looking at multiple screens at once. They're probably looking at their data set, and they're also looking at their documentation, the white paper, they're talking to people, they're Slacking people, whatever, they're trying to get answers. And so we optimize in this case for desktop. You know, in terms of how then, so there's a series of trade-offs that you have to make whenever you decide what your minimum viable product is, and you want to get it out the door. You're going to have to make trade-offs around how much you can get done in the time that you have and the money that you have allocated to actually build the product. And then, of course, in terms of making sure that it works well, we tested with many people. We watched people use the actual product. We worked alongside people. We tried to understand where the pain points were, and then we prioritize those and, you know, go down the list and say, this is going to be more painful, this is less painful, so let's get to this first. And then since we've launched it, kind of like soft launched it, we've had actually many submissions and people who are writing emails to us, and we've reached out to everybody and said, hey, what was your experience? Would you mind telling us how you found us and whether this was useful, or, you know, what was useful, what wasn't useful? So there's kind of that feedback loop as well, where we go and we try to talk to people who have actually used the product. I hope that's helpful. And I'll hand it over to Newman for the second question.
Great. Well, yeah, one thing I would add on that is also the version that we have now, the label that we have now, it's so different than our first label. So we launched a label in 2018 that was largely quantitative and looked really awesome, but it actually wasn't, in my opinion, super legible. And I feel like it was really a proof of concept. I mean, it depends, maybe it was legible to some people. It was extremely, well, you can see it. You can see it in our first white paper, and I think it's somewhere on our website, or it may have been in our deck that we presented, the video you all saw. But then we swung wildly, and we got feedback on that, and then we swung wildly in the other direction for version 2, which was extremely qualitative, to the point where we were actually like having these alerts like all over the label, which that was us as a team feeling sassy and frustrated about how bad data sets were. And so we had like counts of like how much gender bias is in your data set and how much racial bias is in your data set. And it was really like kind of alarming. And then of course we also realize that people don't really want to use those terms to call out that people are, as I said before, proud of their data sets. And it's important for us to include the qualitative information, but it's also important for us to include it in a way that's not so judgy that it's going to discourage people from making labels. And so how can we like be judgy without seeming judgy? Or rather, how can we convey information that feels a little bit more, neutral in its tone, and it feels more educational in its tone? Because really no data set is ever perfect. There's no such thing. And so all data sets have challenges and anomalies, and all have better and worse uses. And so let's make our product about that. And so version 3 is kind of this hybrid of qualitative and quantitative. And it's been through the feedback from designing the labels and then building the labels and then having the labels out in the world. And then basically going back to the drawing board with all this knowledge that we've gotten to what we have now. In addition to what Kasia shared, it's definitely been an evolution. And I think that goes to what Kasia said about, the MVP will not be the final product.
Newman, can I like tell a quick story about language? Yeah. So also words really matter. And something that we learned between the second and the third version is that the way that we frame the questions to get people to respond to this survey, to then fill in the information that appears on the label, really, really matters. And an example I like to use is that we were talking to a data set owner. He had spent 10 years making this index on social vulnerability. And we asked him, so what are some known issues with your data set? And he got really defensive and he said, like, there are no issues with my data. And he said, like, I spent 10 years of my life. I have all these grad students. It's really, really good data. It's the best data out there for the thing that I'm trying to do. It's the only data out there. And we're like, uh-oh, okay, so we've obviously tripped some kind of a wire here. But what we're trying to get and surface are like things that you should know about the data set so that you can use it better. And so we reframed we said, okay, great, no problems with your data set. Next question, do you have any tips for people who want to use your data better? And he was like, oh yeah. These values are inconsistent with those ones. There's some null values there in the middle. These zip codes, they just never even told us anything. And it was literally the same answer, right? But with a different question. And so we found out things like that really matter. It's not so much the UX of the product, like how you actually click through it, but it's more about the framing, the narrative, and the word choice. And we spent a lot of time working with people to identify, like what Newman said, how to make it sound neutral, even when it's like not neutral, but it's like a safe place for people to tell us the truth, basically.
Thanks for that anecdote. I guess just quickly on the second question around opportunities at the intersection of, I think it was art and technology or visual work and technology.
Yeah,
I think
visual arts and tech. Yeah.
Visual arts and tech. I guess it depends. I mean, maybe we could have a longer conversation about it. I'm always happy to chat because I think, within that, like that's still a really big space. But I would say generally, there are calls for work. So you could see like quite a number of museums and other groups are having exhibitions really that thinking about the intersection of art and technology. So I'd say there's open calls where you can submit something if you have work that's produced. If you're working more on the technology side, but you're interested in collaborating with artists, or if you're working more on the art side and you're interested in collaborating with technologists, there's places like MetaLab is one, but there's places all over the world where, artists and technologists can come together to do interdisciplinary projects. And then there's grants. And I think, the Mozilla Foundation, for example, has some really terrific support for kind of the intersection of art and technology. And I actually just shared this advice with somebody yesterday. I think a good forcing function is to have an idea or a work accepted to something, because that kind of helps you get it through the finish line or get support because you know you're going to have an audience. So submitting to a festival like the Ars Electronica Festival, which is one that we're involved with, or the MozFest, which is the Mozilla Festival, and there's others, submitting something that, you know, even if it's mostly a concept, but it's meant to be a work, or if you have some early sketches and then it gets accepted, then that can be a really good driver to build an audience, to find additional funding, and to execute on the work. But and this goes for everybody here. I'm always happy to talk if you want to reach out to me and talk about art and tech. You know, it's very happy to do that anytime. I'll put my email in the chat.
Next up, we're going to have Rohita ask her question.
Hi, I was curious about how you thought about different data sets and different kinds of data sets, and whether you work with, I mean, I'm sure you work with like data sets intended for training AI, but there are, I mean, I generally work with data sets created by governments and organizations that are not intended for that. And when you've had to like work with different kinds of data sets, what did you have to change between data sets intended for training purposes and data sets, say, not for training purposes?
Sure, yeah. So what we have attempted to do is come up with kind of the lowest common denominator of metadata and information about a data set that would enable someone to make some meaningful choices if they want to use it. First of all, determining whether it is actually correct for their usage or applicable for their usage, and then also any kind of tips or tricks around how they should use it. So if you see our label, it's, you know, 2/3 of it is really focused on the use, and then 1/3 is kind of on the normal metadata that you'd expect, like how many instances and what's the type and these types of things. So we don't really make a distinction between training data sets and other data sets, because what we're trying to do is have this core set of metadata that's applicable to all data sets. And then I think that there is space after that for us to get into modularization for domain specificity. So for example, if you're thinking about medical data sets about people, generally speaking, about bodies, about conditions, there might be some things you need to ask there that might be aligned, for example, with the FDA process for validation or verification or these types of things. If you're talking about financial data, that's going to be a totally different kind of data. There's going to be something that's applicable there. If you're talking about these large, common crawl pile type data sets, those are quite different from like a data set on social vulnerability. That is an economics data set that's very small, comparatively. So I think that there is obviously kind of a branching differentiation across domains and use of the data. But what we have so far is basically the lowest common denominator that should be applicable to all data sets. I hope that answers the question.
Now I'm going to invite James back on to ask his question.
Thank you. So I do have an idea. Since you're labeling data, maybe going along the lines of metaphors, you probably could call any data you've labeled organic to maybe give it some more credibility. My question is thinking futuristic, since this work seems to have evolved from, let's say, the micro to it's getting to the macro stage. Do you have any plans to set up a system where if a company was, say, to just dump in their data sets, then it will automatically label them rather than label them with your methodology, rather than maybe they reaching out to you? Because like you did mention, there are companies, like big companies, who wouldn't want to reach out. They probably may reach out to your open source things, but they have their way of doing things already and they are not willing to change their culture. So do you have any plans so that if they were to consider this, they could probably just come dump their data into maybe a system you have set up, and then it would just label it and then check organic or something like that? Do you have plans for that?
Well, That would be really great. I mean, maybe you have ideas on this. One of the challenges is that, I mean, there would have to be some intermediary step, because the thing about our methodology is that it's not automatable, because there's these qualitative questions that have to do with things outside of the data itself. So it requires some subject matter expertise and awareness of the kind of anomalies you might have in a data set. And it's actually the stuff that's not in the data set and is often the context around it that's the most important thing for us to capture. So part of it would make that kind of almost impossible, although we never say never, in terms of it being automated. But to the other part of your question around whether companies could dump in a data set and then some label could come out the other side, I do think that it would be possible and actually pretty awesome if we could staff up sort of an intermediary team that would do the labeling, that would include subject matter experts, that would include others. But we probably, and this again gets into our sustainability model, would have to charge something for that because we pay people to work. And so I really like the idea of people kind of dumping in data sets and our labels coming out the other side, and the company doesn't have to do that work. And what we're figuring out is how do we support the human labor that's required to do the labeling responsibly. And I guess just one other thought, because I feel like you're a few steps ahead of us thinking about the progress that we might try to make. We've come up with some like label light versions of the label, and Kasia spoke about the UN work, and this is we made kind of a special version of a label for them, but our methodology is pretty extensive, and we have talked at various points about a label light that would be it would create less of a barrier to making labels, but it would also have less information. So that's another question. Does it fork? And do we want more labels that are easier to make, that are label light and not quite as extensive? Or do we want fewer that are super extensive? Or do we want both? And how do people choose? And, there's quite a bit that we're still trying to figure out. But I'll pass it to Kasia if you have more ideas.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is that scale and automation is important, but it is also dangerous. And I think it also limits the value of the label, because so much of what we've seen is that the value is in the creation of it, of the label itself, right? So documentation today, and this gets back to this idea of culture change. So documentation today happens after the fact. So you finish with everything, and then before you launch, your product manager says, where's your documentation? And you're like, oh crap, I didn't document anything. I should probably go and document it now. So documentation happens after the fact. And then there's kind of this mad dash and scramble to try to remember what you did. What we would really love, and what we've seen is very powerful about the process that we've built, is that if people are actually using that in the process of building their data, they're building the documentation is a process as well as an artifact. So they are in the process of documenting, they're actually making better choices about their data because the questions are prompting them to make better decisions. Like, who is represented in your data set and why? And then it's like, oh, actually, that's a really good question. I'm only surveying Boston, right? Maybe I should think about their geographies, or I need to make it explicit that this is Boston only. Or, all right, I'm looking at this ER. Well, where are the people coming to, where are they coming from when they're coming to this ER? What's the demographic of the people here? And these kinds of questions end up being really instrumental in the creation of the data set. So just automating after the fact and trying to build 100,000, 1 million labels on existing data sets, there is value in that because the documentation as an artifact is valuable, but there's also the value of documentation as a process and as a change in culture where you're thinking about the thing that you're making while you're making it, as opposed to trying to remember what you did after you've launched it. So I'll throw that out there too as kind of as like a cautionary tale. We don't necessarily want to automate the whole thing, though we do obviously want to make the lift lower for people so that it's easier to make it.
So the goal of SICSS is to kind of, at the end of the day, find some research partners. And to this effect, I wanted to ask you both, how can our students get more involved with the kind of work that you do? And this is the last question.
Well, as I said before, we're really nice. At least I think we're nice. We try to be nice. So reach out to us. You can reach out at info@datanutrition.org. Kasia and I both have also direct emails at datanutrition.org. It's Kasia or Newman at datanutrition.org. And We have various ways of getting involved, whether you want to be using the label maker or the methodology in your own teaching, whether you're looking to plug into some of the work streams that we have going on. I would say just reach out, and we also have a newsletter you can sign up for that we send about one newsletter each year.
I was going to say every 3 years, but sure.
Yeah, every 1 to 3 years our newsletter goes out. So you don't have to worry about your inbox getting overcrowded, but you can sign up to follow us in those ways too. And same with MetaLab, if you're interested in the work that me or Kasha is also affiliated at Harvard. If any of the work that we're doing with respect to Harvard, we're also happy to chat on that as well.
And I'm just going to quickly jump in before Nayanthara closes and just tell folks that it's very important to us that you think about making connections with these organizations. And when our call for proposals for funding is released again, you'll note that there is a special incentive for making contacts with our organizations. So if you're super excited in data nutrition or Deloitte from yesterday or anybody else who's with us for the next 2 weeks or has worked with us before, just know that we would love to help you and help those organizations to make contacts. And I'm going to pass it back to Nayanthara.
Thank you both, Newman and Kasha, for being here with us.
Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.